it's just a beautiful thing, the way that God uses us as the body of Christ to be the hands and feet of Jesus.
The Lord showed me this vision once where he's sitting up on his throne. So it's looking down and I'm in front of him and I'm going back and forth and I'm giving him the what for, saying, this isn't fair. You can't be doing this. Do you not see? Blah, blah, blah. And this is painful. And you're asking me to surrender this? Do you see? That's my only coping mechanism left. I feel like I have left. And now you want that too. And then I get done ranting and I can totally understand David, because he goes on these rants and then he's like, but who else do I have? There's you, God, and you are the king.
There was a time also when I went through a long season of hating God. And of course, who I was actually hating wasn't God. It was my idea of who God was.
He was never threatened by the questions that I had or my attitude or anything. He still managed to bring me around.
I've heard people talk about extending forgiveness to God. And of course, that's completely different than the forgiveness we offer to somebody else, because God has never done anything wrong to us. If anything, he's the only one that has reconciled us to himself.
It brings healing to understand that there are good men. Because for me, I tend to visualize, okay, you're just like my dad, so you are nothing.
I'm just so amazed that the God of the universe is that patient with us, that he will endure that kind of stuff from us and of course we can't stay there, but to work through that kind of thing.
I understood, okay, being a woman is good. There is value in that. And figuring out how to embrace that is also a work worth doing. He's gonna, and then I realized from his embrace like that, it pulled out this feminine response that I'm like, oh my gosh, something's leaking out and I don't know what to do with this. Right. But his masculinity pulled out my response to him and my femininity, and I didn't know what to do with that, and I was talking about it with somebody later, processing. I'm like, this guy came up and hugged me and he totally undid me. I was like, I didn't even know my name. And he goes, oh, that was the true masculine calling to your true feminine. I'm like, is that what that was? Because that was amazing, scary, amazing.
Yep.
And so this whole conference just poured in and pulled out the good. It was amazing.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting that you say that too. I love how God orchestrates what we need, because I've been involved with Living Waters, Melissa and I, my wife and I, for the last 20 years or so as regional coordinators and running the program all that time, or since we've been involved personally ourselves. So it's and I've been to many trainings, and Melissa has too, and love doing that. And they're very pretty sticklers about making sure that men are ministering to men and women to women. And they do understand that there are times when maybe it's through the abuse of a mother toward a boy, or the abuse of a father toward a daughter, or what have you, or the absence, the chronic neglect, whatever, that there are definitely times when the Lord wants to minister to us through the other gender. But usually the way that they minister is by, women putting a hand on the shoulder of a woman, and always wanting women to feel comfortable, especially women to feel comfortable with the ministry that's coming to them, but also the men as well. And but there are those times for sure when the Lord knows, we need that ministry. And what's so beautiful about that too is that it's done in the safety of the group, right? It's done in the safety of really being in the front. And some people might feel like, well, that's not very safe because you're kind of in front of everybody. But yeah, it is safe because you are kind of in front of everybody, and everyone's just kind of dealing with their own ministry stuff, right? Their own stuff before the Lord. And you're not off in some corner somewhere, or off in some separate room. So it's just a beautiful thing, the way that God uses us as the body of Christ to be the hands and feet of Jesus. And we hear that phrase a lot, or that idea a lot. And yet I sometimes I don't think that we think very much about what that actually looks like. Yes, it is helping somebody monetarily. Yes, it's working at the soup kitchen. Of course, it's those things. Those are beautiful things, but also it's allowing our hearts to really connect with the heart of another broken person who, because our hearts have been broken, because we've gone down, some similar pathways or whatever. And the Lord wants to use us again to bring comfort to those, with the comfort he ourselves has given to us, to others. So anyway, I so appreciate your story in that. I also am wondering about, like, when you said, because there was a time also when I went through a long season of hating God. And of course, who I was actually hating wasn't God. It was my idea of who God was. And God had never been cruel to me. God had never been unkind to me, but I sure had an attitude that he had been all of those things plus. And I thought that he hated me, and so I was basically going to return the favor. Well, there was a season where I had to pour that stuff out before the Lord. And of course, also, it's something very important to say is, like, when we extend, I've heard people talk about extending forgiveness to God. And of course, that's completely different than the forgiveness we offer to somebody else, because God has never done anything wrong to us. If anything, he's the only one that has reconciled us to himself. But I do think there are those, like, we ourselves need to go through a process of coming back to a place of trusting him, coming to a place of uniting with him, coming to working through those painful, ugly things, even hateful things. And I'm just so amazed that the God of the universe is that patient with us, that he will endure that kind of stuff from us and of course we can't stay there, but to work through that kind of thing. Do you have thoughts about that in particular?
Yeah, so I've had others ask me too. So, did you go through a period of hating God? Especially when he wanted to be daddy. And I can honestly say I didn't. I
Mm-hmm.
never hated him. I mean, I went through that anger,
Yep.
which was pretty intense. But there were things that I would get mad, and I would okay, you and I need to talk about this because this just doesn't seem fair. This is what you're asking of me, and you can't see. Are you kidding me? You can't
Mm-hmm.
see. And the Lord showed me this vision once, where he's sitting up on his throne. So it's looking down, and I'm in front of him, and I'm going back and forth, and I'm giving him the what for, saying, this isn't fair. You can't be doing this. Do you not see? Blah, blah, blah. And this is painful. And you're asking me to surrender this? Do you see? That's my only coping mechanism left. I feel like I have left. And now you want that too. I'm going back and forth, back and forth. And the Lord's just sitting there, and he's so concerned. He's like, oh,
Mm-hmm.
ooh, yeah, oh yeah, And then I get done ranting, and I can totally understand David, because he goes on these rants, and then he's like, "But who else do I have? There's you, God, and you are the King."
Mm-hmm.
And so I get done ranting, and I come to that place, and I'm like, "But Lord, you're the Lord, and and I know you got me, and blah blah blah." And so in this, once I came to that, I'm just like, okay, I don't guess I'm done. I don't have anything else to complain about. And then in the vision, he shows me crawling up on his lap, and he puts his arms around me. And I'm just like,
Mm-hmm.
wow. And it was from that experience that I realized, you're not afraid of my questions. You're not afraid of my anger. You're not afraid.
Yeah.
Because I went through another season too, where he was telling me all these things that I needed to be obedient to. And I was done. I'm like, Lord, no, I'm not doing that. I can't. And besides, who are you to tell me what to do? Who are you to tell me what to do? I know you're God, but who are you really? What makes you think you can always tell me what to do? Kind of rebellious, bratty little kid. And so I get out the graveyard, and I'm like, you know what? We're going to settle this today, because I want to know, who are you to be telling me this stuff to do? What gives you the authority? And I relayed this story to other people, and they're like, you talked to the Lord like that? You asked him who he was to be telling you? Like, I did, because I needed to know. So I get out of the car, and I'm standing in this roundabout looking down over this valley. I was just like, Lord, I just need to know. I just need to know. And I don't know how to explain it, other than I feel like the Lord pulled back this curtain, and I saw this glory that there's no words for. And I'm like, okay, you are God. You are God. You're God. I have no doubt now. I have no doubt. And it was like I it was like a slice of heaven that I got to see or something. And I felt it. And I'm just like, I mean, that settled it. I'm like, you're God. All right. So what was it you wanted me to do now?
Yeah,
You
exactly.
know?
Yes.
But it was so cool because he's like, okay, I need to settle this for you because you're kind of stuck. And he's not afraid of, you know what, this is who I am. You know,
Yep.
and now you get a choice. Either you do what I'm asking or you don't. I'm like,
Yep. Right.
okay, you know, yeah. So he
Well,
was.
oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to say he was
Did
never
I interrupt you?
threatened by the. Yeah,
Yes.
he was never threatened by
Yes.
the questions that I had or my attitude or anything. He still managed to bring me around.
Yeah. Well, it's so powerful, and what you described in terms of the brokenness relating to your own father, or the lack there of him relating to you at all, and the way the impact that had on your life, and again, seeing your mother as one that was just under his thumb and basically being abused, and seeing that just kind of transferred onto you as a girl, and the reaction to all of that. But and you talked about Living Waters and having an experience with a couple of these guys that were safe and prayed up and that kind of thing, part of the leadership team, and how that was very healing. And I love, again, that God just gives us over and over and over again opportunities for him to bring healing to specific places through the body of Christ, that without the body of Christ, the healing doesn't come. Like you experienced a lot of healing directly from God, which is beautiful. And I have too. I think he does that for us, but he doesn't do it all just between us and him. He really does require that we allow imperfect, broken people into our lives, that he uses them as a conduit in their lives, to be a conduit of his grace, to meet certain needs and to bring healing to broken places. So you mentioned spiritual fathers. Talk a little bit more about that in terms of your church experiences. How have they served God in ministering to you in your life?
Sure. I think the best example of that, as far as a spiritual dad, and then again as a brother, was when I lived with the family. The Lord placed me in this family, and they had 3 kids. They had a son who was 8, and then a daughter who was 5, and then a younger one she was like 2 months old when I moved in. And so I felt like I got a new childhood. You know, I got to see a healthy dad respond to his children, bring correction in a loving way, and then a healthy husband, you know, treat his wife and watch, you know, the wife respond to her husband. I watched him do stuff for his wife. And at first I'm like, wow, my dad never did that. You know, what are you doing? Is that okay? Are you supposed to do that? You know? But, you know, he would do the dishes, he would do all this stuff. And I'd be like, because my dad would be like, great dinner. And then he'd go sit down, and my mom is, you know, left to clean up, or, you know, she would make the meal. But here he is helping his wife, you know, and I can remember, you know, him stopping what he's doing and talking to his children and saying, okay, what was your question? What did you need help with? Okay, you know what? Let me finish this one thing and I'll be right there. So he'd finish that one thing and he'd go right over there. And I can remember Abby, the littlest one, there was a wood stove and she constantly wanted to touch it, you know, and he would tell her, sweetheart, that's hot. It's going to burn your fingers. And she had done it one too many times, and he took her hand and he slapped her fingers. Of course, she had never been, I mean, it wasn't even that hard, but it was the shock that my dad hit my hand, you know, and she's sobbing. So he picks her up, sets her on his lap, and he's like, sweetheart, I needed to teach you a lesson. You can't touch that. That's, you know, and I'm just like, this is really happening. You're explaining to her that why you did. Wait, okay, that just rocked my whole world, because here he disciplined her, and then he brought the comfort too. And I'm like, okay, is this really happening? You know? And then to find out years later, I was with them like 3 years ago. We were all hanging out, and I said, you know, I just want to thank you guys, because everything that you've poured into me, my life is now fruit of your obedience, fruit of your labor. Yes. You know, all the things that you were obedient to, I get to be the fruit of that. And so they began to tell me the places that they stood up for me, I had no idea. So Rob, his parents were like, what are you thinking? You've got a little girl in there, you got a 5-year-old, and you got this person
Yeah.
living with you. What are you thinking? And Rob's like, no, this is what the Lord has called us to do. And you'll see, it's not going to be like this always. So he stood up for me. He protected me. And I can remember one time in a restaurant, and I'm kind of in that in between stage. So I kind of felt like I was at the mercy of, if you called me sir, I just went with it. If you called me ma'am, I just went with it. And we're in this restaurant, and there was a table next to us, and these guys were kind of making fun of me. And Rob leaned over and he goes, are they talking about you? I said, yeah, I think so. So he said, hey, you need to mind your own business. And I'm just like, oh my gosh. But he totally protected me, stuck up for me, and I was like, yeah, leave me alone. It's like, but it was amazing because he was truly an honorable man. And even this weekend, I was visiting with them, and I was watching him, and I'm like, you have been such a great example for me to see how you've provided for your family, how you've protected your wife, how you've raised your kids, how you've taken the time. I'm just like, wow, because that really shifted my paradigm, and that helped me because I was already trying to figure out, okay, so are all men like my dad? Because the Lord says they're not, but how do I know that? And then Rob came in and shifted all of that. And then, Kim kind of being like the spiritual mom was my mentor. I told them, I said, I'm amazed that you guys hung in there with me because I was such a jerk. So thank you, for continuing to press into the Lord and be obedient to Him. Because I knew that there was times I was still a hot mess. And
Oh yeah, I hear you. Well, and it reminds me of so much of your story. I think anytime that we share our stories, that it doesn't matter who it is. They might not deal with gender dysphoria, might not deal with same-sex attraction, might not deal with any of the kind of outer workings of what people think we're dealing with or what we think we're dealing with. And yet the story is similar, and it winds up leading into some area of significant brokenness. And I love, though, how you're talking about being a part of this family, because I experienced the same thing. I've had a couple of families that invited me in to live with them, and my dear friends Dave and Kathy had young boys at the time, and here I'm dealing with same-sex attraction and this life of having once been a bartender at a gay club and having given my life to Christ, but now coming to a place of, through a series of stuff I don't have time to get into now, just wound up in a really pretty bad place between me and the Lord. And here they invited me into their home to move from upstate New York back out to Arizona to live with them, just to kind of heal up and just be with the Lord and be with them. And it was, there's no way of really highlighting the value, and I know it, I can hear it in what you're saying, highlighting the value of being in an environment that is just kind of saturated in the dynamic of having a pretty healthy family. No family is perfect. In some ways, every family is dysfunctional. It's just kind of the level at which they are. But being in a place where they deal with stuff, being in a place where you have a father who's gentle with his children, but also firm. You see the relationship between the husband and wife as being something that, is, again, not perfect, but it actually is really wholesome and life giving. It has a deep effect in changing our hearts. I think I remember one occasion particularly, well, not just one occasion. I just remember moving in with them for a period of time. I was so unaccustomed to people in the home I grew up in and the churches I grew up in. I was so unaccustomed to people just let your yes be yes and your no no. I was so unaccustomed to people just being honest. I grew up in an environment, and I swam in the waters of it, so I didn't even recognize what it was until moments like living with this family, where they were, when they were happy to do something for you, they just said it. Like, I'd love to do this. Or if it didn't work out and there was something I couldn't do, they would say that too, which I thought, well, that was really abrupt. But it was because I was so unaccustomed to there was nothing abrupt about it. It was just clear. But what I began to relax into and realize is, oh, like when they say something, I don't have to think, what did they mean by that? I mean, everything in my life prior to that had been, what do they mean by that? I mean, do you relate to that at all in your family dynamic?
Well, the family that I lived with, yes, but in my family, it was like you walked on eggshells. So you had to
Yep.
make sure that your answer was palatable, or you just didn't say anything at all to save face, And my dad was a jokester, so you always laughed at his stuff, but you never played
Mm-hmm.
a joke on him because
Mm.
that was not good. But
Yep.
he could play all the jokes anytime on you, right?
Yeah.
And you're just like, okay, this isn't fair. How does this work? And so
Mm-hmm.
you realize just to go with it, But yeah, it was such a difference night and day between living with Kim and Rob and then what I grew up in. Total
Mm-hmm.
difference. Total
Mm-hmm.
difference. Because in
Yeah.
one I didn't have any value. I wasn't heard, totally misunderstood, whatever. And then here's Kim and Rob totally validating, no, you've totally got value. You're worthy, you're great,
Mm-hmm.
instilling. And it was interesting because Kim, um, really, I didn't know that her and I are wired almost exactly the same. And
Mm.
so when she began to mentor me, we didn't talk about the issues. We didn't talk about, when I was struggling with something, I'd be like, I just have a question about how did you figure out, what was a woman like? She goes, oh,
Mm-hmm.
well, I just, she goes, you probably won't be able to relate to this, but my mom and dad did this for me. And that really showed me that affirms my identity. And I'm like, yeah, I have no place for that.
Mm-hmm.
There's no frame of reference for that. And the books that I read was how I was wired. So like intercession, prophetic, and all that kind of things was actually really encouraged my identity, because it really wasn't about figure out who you are as male or female, but figure out who you are in the Lord. And from that, the abundance that helped me to want to be more of a woman, to be more feminine,
Mm-hmm.
to figure out, it was the weirdest thing. Because when somebody's like, so what books did you read? Did you read this? Did you read that? I'm like, no, I didn't. This is what I read. And they're like, oh, well,
Yeah.
that's weird. I'm like, yeah, but it worked.
Yeah. That's right. The proof's in the pudding, as they say, right?
That's right.
Yep.
That's right.
No, that's great. That's great. Well, so what would you, just as we're kind of wrapping up here and winding down a little bit, how would you kind of describe the value of the masculine, the value of a father in the role of bringing healing to broken places in our lives?
Well, I think if, even if they're not necessarily like our spiritual father, but they're definitely a good role model,
Mm-hmm.
it brings healing to understand that there are good men. Because for me, I tend to visualize, okay, you're just like my dad, so you are nothing. Not realizing that he may have tendencies like my dad, right? But he's not my dad. But
Yeah.
when I looked at the good role models, I understood, okay, being a woman is good. There is value in that. And figuring out how to embrace that is also a work worth doing. It also showed me that boundaries are good, because even as a woman, when you grow up in a broken household, when a man does something that's not appropriate, you have that gut feeling. You're like, I don't think this is good. But because you didn't have a dad who represented what is good, you go along with the bad because you don't understand
Mm-hmm.
I have value, so therefore I can draw a boundary. And that's one of the things that I saw in Rob is if, you go back to the honesty, if Rob did something, Kim was like, that's not going to work. We need to talk about this. And I was like, okay, now they're going to fight. And they never did. Like, it's all geared up and
That was it.
okay.
That was a bridge too far. Yep.
Yeah. So when I looked at that, I'm like, okay, so it's good to understand that you have value, not arrogant or prideful, but to be confident that, yeah, God created you on purpose for a purpose. So therefore you have value. He wrote out a plan for you because you have value. You're valuable to the kingdom. And it's figuring out what is that purpose and how do I carry that out? Lord, what do you say about that? And allowing the Lord to speak into that place. And Rob was just such a great example of, kind of showing, okay, I'm going to be this really healthy role model, even for my daughters, because then they're like, you know what? I can understand how now to interact with the opposite sex in a healthy way. and I saw that too. Okay, there is a healthy way to interact with a man, and I don't have to be afraid of that, because that's one thing that my dad instilled, because he's constantly accusing my mom of having an affair. She never did, so I don't know why he was so insecure. But when in my healing process, to sit next to a man, I'd be like, is he thinking I'm inappropriate? Is this okay? He's married. Is his wife going to freak out because I'm sitting next to him? But when I watched that, I was like, okay, there is a healthy way for men and women to interact and it not be sexual. It's just, you're a man, I'm a woman. We know there's natural boundaries. And I was like, okay, that really tweaked my thinking too. Cause then I'm like, okay, I can sit by some guy and not be afraid, one, that he's going to do something inappropriate, or that he's thinking I'm inappropriate. So this whole undoing of thinking process was amazing.
Yep. Well, and I love what you're saying there in terms of bringing that out, Kathy Grace, because so many of us have a myriad of thoughts in moments, it seems like. And those kind of thoughts, oftentimes we might feel like, oh my gosh, I'm really bizarre. Why am I thinking about this? Why am I fixating on this? But that idea of being in a place and wondering, oh my gosh, is his wife thinking that I'm going to be inappropriate, or that he's going to be inappropriate, and all these different layers of things that really the Lord just wants us to be able to come to a place of being able to receive healing and therefore being able to rest. And yes, there are ways that women should be, and God's given a grace for them to bless one another and to be, closely connected, and for brothers in Christ to have that same thing. And there's a different and special union between ourselves and our spouse if we're married that's unique from everything else. But we can have these deep and really connected bonds of love and brotherhood or sisterhood within the body of Christ. And so I love how you just kind of described some of the things that can get in the way of that. As for those that are listening or viewing, I would also love if you could kind of give us a little bit more of a picture of what the forgiveness looked like with your dad, and the reconciliation. And those two things can be very different. Sometimes, we're always called to forgive, but sometimes reconciliation is unwise and not possible. But oftentimes forgiveness leads to reconciliation because it can be safe. But you also talked about the need for boundaries and recognizing what those were. And if he started stepping on kind of you as a person or whatever, violating some of that stuff, you were able to put up a boundary. And that's a very good thing too. So I'd love for you to speak to kind of all of that a bit. I know it's a lot, but is your dad still alive?
No, my dad passed 12 years ago.
Okay.
And I'm so grateful for the process that I went through, because I grieved that as a loss. It truly was a loss for me. So the forgiveness, I worked with two women, and they said, I want you to come with a list of all the offenses that you believe you have with your dad. And then they're like, and then sit with the Lord to see if there's anything that you didn't write down. So I did all that. I bring this piece of paper, and it's like full of stuff.
Right.
And so we start working through, Lord, I forgive my dad for this, how abusive he was, the language that he used. And he had a mouth like a sailor, that guy, colorful adjectives all the time. And so as I worked through that forgiveness, and then they're like, okay, so now we want you to bless him. And I'm like, no, I'm not doing that. And I left. I'm like, no, I'm not. So I'd faithfully come back, but then they're like, okay, so we need you to bless him, because that's how you release it, because you can't hold him in this place. I'm like, oh yes, I can. I left. And so finally the Lord's like, seriously, you truly need to bless him. And it doesn't release him from what he's done. It releases you from what he's done to you. And I'm like, okay, well, why couldn't they have just explained that to me? Then it might have been easier, because it took about 3 weeks for me to get to the place of blessing, because I couldn't understand why he gets a get out of jail free card, until the Lord said, yeah, it's not for him. It's for you. I'm going to deal with him, but you need to release him so I can deal with him. Oh, okay. So I go in, and they're like, okay, are you ready to bless him today? And I said, I think so. And so they're like, wow, really? And I said, yeah, the Lord explained to me that it was not just letting him go, it was releasing him to the Lord. It was for me. And they're like, yeah, sorry, we should have told you that. And I'm like, okay. So it took a bit still because there would be certain things, to bless him for. I couldn't get around it yet. My heart, I knew that was the right thing to do, but I
Yep.
just didn't want to do it to check it off the list. I'm like, my
Yes,
heart needs to be
exactly.
in the right place. So that the whole forgiveness process probably took about 10 weeks, just working through the forgiveness part too, because I would just sob and sob and sob after I forgave him, because it was like there was so much pain behind those
Mm.
offenses. And then once I got to the forgiveness part, they're like, okay, wow, this has been amazing, now you don't have to come and meet with us anymore, and if anything else rises up, you just say, Lord, I forgive my dad for, and I bless him, whatever. And I'm like, okay, I can do that. So it was about 2 weeks later, the Lord spoke to me. It was like a week before Father's Day. And the Lord said, I want you to buy your dad a Father's Day card and put your phone number in there so he could call you. And I said to the Lord, are you crazy? Are you crazy? But yeah, I wanted to at the same time. And
Hmm.
because honestly, there was that need. I wanted my daddy to be proud of his daughter, right? I
Mm.
wanted him to be proud of me for this work that I've just done. And so I went to the store and I'm looking through these cards and I'm just like, nope, not saying that. Oh, no, no.
Yes,
So,
I
so I
know.
find this
Yep.
it was painful just picking out a card.
Yep.
So I find this very generic card, Happy Father's Day. And I think it said Daddy in it, Happy Father's Day, Daddy. And so I just signed my name and I said, if you ever want to get together for coffee, here's my number. So I sent it on a Thursday. It takes about a day. He called me Saturday. It's like,
Wow.
are you kidding me? I know. He wanted to talk. And so I took his phone call and he's like, hey, so were you serious about meeting for coffee? And I'm like, I am. And he's like, okay, well, what are you doing later today? I'm like, okay, whoa. How about tomorrow? Let's meet, And he's like, yeah, I'll jump in the truck and meet you right now. And I said,
Right.
no, let's do this tomorrow and let's meet at this place. And he goes, you don't want to come to the house? I'm like, no, let's go to this restaurant. Because I'm like, no, we're doing this in public place. I don't want to be alone with
Hmm.
you just yet at your house. So we met, we had coffee, and he's all jovial and joking and happy. And he's like, yeah, it's really good. I'm so glad that you sent me this card. That was kind of like the very first time he's ever told me he was glad I did something for him.
Hmm.
And I can remember just looking at him and I said, really? And he's like, yeah, I meant that. I'm like, okay, wow. My dad actually can give a sideways comment or compliment. And so after that, it was the next week. He's like, so do you want to meet up tomorrow? I'm like, no, but how about next week? Let's do Wednesday and I'll come to your house. He's like, oh, okay, great. So it was the house I grew up in. So I'm just like,
Wow.
when I first walked in, I just wanted to throw up,
Yeah.
you know, but I made myself sit down, had coffee, we joked around, and I said, oh man, I need to go because I need to get my oil changed. And he goes, wow, I can change your oil. And the Lord said, take him up on it. And I'm like,
Mm.
oh. And I said, really? You'd change my oil for me? And he's like, yeah, absolutely. Sure enough, he changed my oil. He hopped right on it. He was so excited to do that. And so it was probably about 3 months into this. He asked me to live there, like, because he was getting older. And he's like, hey, so I'm thinking, how about I pay you and you come and you live here? And I said, pay me for what? And he goes, help around the house, do the laundry, keep the house clean. In my mind, I'm thinking, oh, no. And I said, so basically you're looking for a caretaker. He said, yes, yes, that's totally right. And I said, well, here's the deal. I can't do that. What do you mean you can't do that? I said, well, for one, Dad, I have a career. and I'm just not going to quit my job to come live here. He goes, well, you wouldn't pay any rent. You wouldn't have this, all your utilities. And I said, and I so appreciate that. However, I have a career, I have a job, I have all this stuff. I'm not interested in moving. I just found this really cute apartment about a year ago. I can't do it. So you're going to let your dear old dad just die in the house. And I said, I did not say that. That's your interpretation. So I could see, here I am beginning to build these boundaries, right? And to be honest with him, I can remember leaving that meeting going, okay, wow, what just happened? I didn't cower to him. And then from there, I could tell, his thinking, he just works it through and over in his mind. And he calls me and he starts accusing me of all this stuff. And then I'm like, okay. I was wondering how long this was going to take. Yep. So he's going on accusing me of all this stuff. And I said, I don't know where you're getting your information, but I have never said that to you. I've never done that to you. He goes, well, you proclaim that you're this Christian and all this stuff. And I said, okay, wait, I haven't proclaimed I'm a Christian. I told you I got saved, but you're the one that's always saying about how much you pray. Have you ever heard that from me? Okay, well, that's not exactly what I meant. But anyways, then he changes the subject, right? And so after that, I said, this has been a really hard and difficult conversation. But I think from here on out, I don't think you should call me anymore because we really have a difference of opinion now. And that's becoming really quite clear that you want me to do something for you that I just can't do. And so now you're angry with that. And so you call me with all these accusations and I can't do this anymore with you. So I hung up. I didn't even say goodbye. I just hung up. And I said to the Lord, Lord, I've done this reconciliation now. And I said, my dad is showing me he's just not a safe man. How much longer do I stay in this relationship? He's still the abusive man that I know. And so my brothers invited me over to play pool with him. So it was my dad and I have a younger brother and an older brother. So we're playing pool and my dad is being the jerk. And so I said to the Lord, Lord, he has not changed. And you want me to reconcile with this guy. He has not changed. And the Lord said, I'm not asking him to change. I'm asking you. I'm like, are you kidding me? And what I realized what the Lord meant was that to kindly continue to draw the boundary and to cut the relationship. Because after I left there, the Lord said, you know what? You're right. Your dad is not a safe man anymore. And you don't have to continue this relationship any longer. And I said, seriously? He's like, yeah, seriously. So I'm like, all right. So the next time my dad calls, I said, I really mean it this time. Please lose my phone number. I can't talk to you anymore because Dad, really, honestly, you're abusive and this is not healthy. Our relationship is not healthy and it's growing more and more unhealthy and I can't participate with this. And I said, I'm hanging up now. And I hear as I'm putting the phone to the receiver, don't you hang up on me. Don't you hang up. Click. It's like, sorry about that. But yeah, I ended it and it was interesting because for a week I felt this feeling. I just felt blue and sad. And I said, Lord, what is this that I feel? And the Lord said, your dad hurt you and you're experiencing that hurt now as an adult. And today you can deal with that. I'm like, oh, wow. And then it was probably, 10 years later when my dad passed. It was sad to me. And I was like, Lord, I know I didn't have a relationship with him, but now, like when I'm gardening still, it's like, man, I wish I could call my dad because he would know what to do. And my brothers and sisters are like, are you kidding me? He's the biggest jerk and blah, blah, blah. I'm like, I know, but he knew what to do. But they haven't worked through any of that forgiveness. And so they were all celebrating, that he passed. And I'm like, oh, because he died alone too. Yeah. And I felt so bad for him, but I knew that would happen. The Lord showed me, your dad's going to die alone. Yeah. And I'm like, that's even more heartbreaking. But
what a thing you're describing in terms of the Lord's grace and mercy in reconnecting you guys. And yes, even though it's sad. I mean, it could have been something that could have been a blessing for him, and as well as for you. And yet, even with it not being that, that there was still a kind of healing, a release, a healing that allows you to actually feel, to humanize him, to have a tender heart toward him, as opposed to celebrating that he's dead,
Right.
or just not,
Right.
or feeling numb, completely numb. And I think that just really underscores and highlights the power of forgiveness that God gifts us to be able to release.
Right. Well, and I
So,
think part of it was too is after I'd worked through all of this forgiveness stuff, the Lord showed me my dad's heart. And he said, your dad did love you. He just
hmm,
couldn't give you what you needed. He didn't know how to love you. He was bankrupt. He didn't understand
yeah,
he had value. So he couldn't give you what he didn't have. And when the Lord showed me that, I was so grieved. And
mm,
I had grace for my dad. It's like I totally
hmm,
understood. And even though he was starting to turn to his old wretched self that I grew up with, I had grace for him because I totally understood, and I understood his thinking and how he would go around and around in his mind and get all worked up about how he was wronged. And then,
yeah,
he had to release it. And so I was that punching bag, but I was like,
mm,
wow. But yeah, I was amazed after the Lord showed me that, how much grace I had for him. Cause I'm like,
mm,
yeah, I understand you weren't loved either. You didn't know what that was like.
yeah, yeah. Well, I just love this conversation, Kathy Grace, and really what you're highlighting. I think that's coming up today, in my mind. Certainly, we wanted to talk about fathers. We wanted to talk about, obviously, our natural biological fathers, those that raise us, the experience of that, and then also the way that God can really redeem that through the body of Christ and through fathers, spiritual fathers, stepping into those roles, older brothers stepping into those roles, to be able to heal places in our hearts that need, like you said in the beginning, broken in relationship, made whole in relationship. We often say that too, but then in addition, the piece about living with others, that piece about opening up our homes for others, that's really highlighted, I think, in Psalm 68:6, which says God takes the lonely and puts them in family, and only a
Yes.
rebellious person dwells in a parched land. But the nature of God is to take the lonely and put them in family. And I think there's so many broken, lonely people, as I certainly was, aching to be in an environment that is wholesome. And just there's so much more power in that than just even didactic learning, the experience of it, the ability to see it modeled, a whole
Yeah.
enough picture of fatherhood, of motherhood, of husbanding and being a wife, and all of that is just it's a beautiful experience. And then really the icing on the cake too is talking about that process of releasing forgiveness, and to be able to that your heart was really tenderized by the Lord, and that you're able to have a kind of compassion that in the natural we could never have. All we could possibly have in the natural is bitterness and animosity. And yet the Lord has been able to bring you to a place of that, a tender heart toward your father. So anyway, thank you so much for sharing with
Yeah.
us. I really appreciate that, Kathy Grace. Any final kind of last, you don't have to have something, but anything that has been on your mind, you're like, oh, I wish I'd said this, anything at all there?
No, just to reinforce that there is so much power in forgiveness and so much healing available that we don't
Yeah.
even understand, even if it's just done in obedience, there's something that's
Hmm.
taken off that and which allows us to receive whatever it is the Lord wants to pour into. It's an
Yeah.
amazing thing.
Yeah. And also you've just talked about, and I've mentioned it too in my own life, just that journey of, it's not like God says something and so often we're like, oh, yep, sure. It's there's a wrestling and a fighting and being kind of childish in our responses, but God is so good to bear with us in that. So for those
Mm-hmm.
watching, listening, thank you for joining us for this episode of the Love and Truth Network podcast. But wherever you're at in your life, no matter whether you're really struggling with some deep patterns of sin or addiction, or if your life is seemingly by other people's account, maybe your own account, is pretty solid, pretty good. And yet this conversation about fatherhood, or the same thing could apply to our moms too. If this conversation has stirred up some thoughts and some memory, the Holy Spirit maybe is bringing some loving conviction to you, or maybe there's some unforgiveness still there, or bitterness, or what have you. The Lord does want to see us walk in freedom from those things, and to lay those things down, to really bind them to the cross and walk in genuine freedom for those. So I hope that this podcast has benefited you and encouraged you. And we just want to invite you again to join us in a future episode of the Love and Truth Network podcast. Take care. Thank you so much for joining us for this Love and Truth Network podcast. To listen to or view future episodes, please check us out at loveandtruthnetwork.com/podcast. You may also subscribe to Apple Podcast, Spotify, or Google Music. Thank you so much, and we'll see you in a future episode.